Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University and my colleagues, welcome to our press conference on Trump's immigration initiatives on his first 100 days in office. I'm Oni Advincula. I'm the coordinator at the center. Thank you for being here with us. As part of our Not Your Same Old Sources series, this briefing is so timely and crucial as the Trump administration has kicked off his second term with a flurry of executive actions on immigration. So if you have a question during the presentation, please post your name and your question in the chat box. And so let's start with this briefing. I will hand it over to our moderator, Daisy Calavia Robertson, who is a columnist at New Jersey Advanced Media, focusing on issues impacting New Jersey's communities of color. Daisy, take it away.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Anthony, and thank you to the Center for Cooperative Media for organizing this very needed and informative webinar. As the proud daughter of immigrants and a longtime professional journalist, it is an honor for me to moderate today's discussion. Now, we all know that during Trump's campaign trail, he repeatedly vowed to carry out the largest mass deportation order in our nation's history. And just a few hours after being sworn in as president, he seemed to make good on that promise by signing a barrage of executive orders targeting undocumented immigrants in our country. From birthright citizenship to canceling and shutting down the CBP1 app, where thousands of people were just waiting for their appointments at least 8 different ports of entries, and it just had their dreams and hopes shattered just within seconds, to threatening to remove federal funding from sanctuary cities. Here in New Jersey, we have many sanctuary cities that could potentially be impacted by this, and many other ones. Now, I have some people here today that are much more knowledgeable than I am about this topic, and I want to introduce you to them. I'll start with Mr. Oscar A. Chacon. He's a senior policy advisor and co-founder of Alianza Americas, a national nonprofit focused on advocating for immigrants in the U.S. Oscar, how are you today?
I'm doing good. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for the work that you've done for so long to advocate for immigrants here in the U.S. Now, my question for you is simple, but I'm sure that your answer is going to be very complex. We've seen the devastation that Trump's executive orders have already set in motion in just a few hours of him making his way back to the White House. What can we expect in his first 100 days in office?
Well, first of all, again, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I just want to begin by saying that today, the 22nd of January, it's a very meaningful day for me. It is exactly 45 years ago that I first came to the US, and I've been residing in this country ever since. I used to live in New York. I used to live in New Jersey for a little bit. That's just a way of saying that, everything about immigrants and immigration and all the ways in which those issues connect, with the rest of the country are very dear to my heart. They're not just an academic interest or a professional interest. They are basically defining issues for me, for my family, and for very many people I love. And in order to even attempt to answer your question, I think it is important to understand that Donald Trump and the people behind him did not really invent, this hatred against immigrants. In so many ways, he is a continuation of a campaign that goes back at least for decades. And it's been for that long that we've been hearing very consistently, sometimes somewhat less, in a less intense manner than lately, these stories about immigrants of today as criminals, as narco traffickers, as prostitutes, as rapists, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is something that, again, goes back at least 4 decades, actually even longer. I mean, if you go back to the very recent time in which people were saying that nobody born in this country should be a citizen unless, they were officially admitted in the US, that goes back, again, at least 5 decades in its most recent incarnation. So what we've seen beginning on Monday afternoon is indeed a display of a number of actions, some of which take meaning immediately. Just to give you an example, everyone who had been told to apply for an appointment at the US southern border using something called CBP1, which was the app, for people to request appointments, they were immediately canceled. And there is nothing people can do. The tens of thousands of people who had applications pending to be able to enter the US using a mechanism put in place by the previous president, Joe Biden, known as humanitarian parole, specifically people from Haiti, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, they're, again, completely without any validity anymore. And then we have, obviously, the southern border, where clearly Trump is planning to make a big display of force. They are basically using whatever existing laws allow them to use resources probably meant for something else, but now to be used to continue, for example, building the border wall at the southern border. So these are examples of things that are already happening. I mean, these aren't waiting, for something to be done. This is already happening. But then there are so many other of these executive orders where what we are really seeing is more a direction in which this administration wants to go, not only over the next 98 days, but the next 4 years, for sure, at a minimum. And in my opinion, this also resonates very closely with something we knew from the previous Trump administration, and it is how much of a fan he is of exercising presidential authority in ways that nobody ever has before, because in the past, people really respect law and respect norms that were supposed to be observed by our maximum leaders. Clearly, those do not seem to matter for President Trump. One case in point is the executive order pretending to redefine the meaning of birthright citizenship. The 14th Amendment of the United States makes it abundantly clear about how it's supposed to work. But he is trying, as a matter of presidential decree, to basically reinterpret, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And let me just end by saying that even though the most talked about promise, namely massive deportations immediately after taking office, isn't yet necessarily taking shape. You may recall that there was a specific threat about Chicago, which is the metropolitan area where I reside. So far, we haven't seen, any of these promised massive deportation operation coming into place. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but it also means that this is also a characteristic of this administration. They're using fear, and specifically fear that maybe tomorrow they'll come for me, as a way of also enticing people to self-deport, which is something they are hoping will happen. But I think that, again, overall, the impact on communities is already being felt. There are children crying because they don't know whether their parents will be for them when they come back from school. He just made it public yesterday that schools, churches, and medical centers are not going to be respected when it comes to immigration enforcement operations. So I think clearly this is the environment where we are. And the last thing I'll say, just in terms of this particular initial question, is let's not forget that all of this is a major, big time distraction of attention show. The bottom line is immigrants have been a blessing for the United States of America. They always were, we are now. And frankly, the attack against immigrants is an effort to keep us divided, to keep us definitely looking the other way. But in reality, immigrants, as I said before, have been a blessing to the country. And I want to just say for the last thing that I'm so grateful to Bishop Marianne Edgar Budd, who yesterday dared to challenge, yes, in a house of worship, the president in terms of asking for compassion. And I think we've all have seen the reactions by President Trump following that particular episode, which I think is an act of bravery and ultimately an act of faith on her part.
Thank you for that, Oscar. I really, really appreciate it. Now, before we move on, I do want to mention two things. The first being that, the executive order pertaining to birthright is being challenged in the court. 22 Democratic states, the attorney generals at 22 Democratic states have already pursued legal action to try to stop that from happening. And also that, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar, but Mexico has recently launched the Consul app. In Spanish, it's called Consul Contigo. And it's an app that's only available as of right now for Android phones. It's exclusively for Mexican nationals who are in the US. And it includes an emergency feature that will immediately alert relatives and officials at their nearest Mexican consulate if the person happens to find themselves being detained. It also has legal resources for people who are facing deportation. Now, unfortunately, it is only for people who are from Mexico. I know you mentioned earlier people from Nicaragua and Guatemala and Cuba, Venezuela, and Haiti don't have a resource like the Consul app. But for people who are from Mexico, this is something that the government has launched in response to President Trump's presidency and likely even his shutdown of the CBP One app, as you mentioned earlier. But yeah, thank you so much for that overview. I do now want to introduce our second guest on the panel. Ms. Micauri Vargas. She's an associate counsel of the Democracy and Justice Program at the NJ Institute for Social Justice, a racial and social justice advocacy nonprofit here in the Garden State. Hi, Micauri.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Daisy. Sorry, I was finding my mute button. It's nice to be here with everyone and an honor to be speaking along with Ellie and Oscar. And I just learned so much from listening to Oscar speak on all that information he just provided.
Right, I know he was great. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining us, Micauri. I would love it if you could just shed some light on some of your organization's initiatives to help people here in the Garden State navigate this difficult and very uncertain time.
Yeah, for sure. And the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, we are a racial justice organization here in New Jersey, a state level organization. We focus primarily on 3 different pillars, now 4 actually, of social justice work. Environmental justice is our newest pillar, but we've historically been working in an economic justice, criminal justice reform, and democracy and justice, which is the space I live in currently. And, as a democracy voting person, the results of the last election really highlight the growing alienation felt by people of color, specifically immigrant communities, and that feeling of not feeling heard, unrepresented, and feeling, that our political system just isn't working for us. And we see that in all the different ways that this election came to be. We feel very disconnected, and we've felt a strong calling, obviously, for all of this work throughout our lives, but now more than ever, we feel this need to really stand in solidarity with our partners who work directly on these issues, specifically like, with immigrant communities and how to protect them. That has not been most of our work, but we are making strides to provide that kind of support going forward. To name one, for instance, is the Million Voters Project, which I will probably, I'm not sure if Ellie's going to cover this when you speak with her next, but this is a program that is being spearheaded by Make the Road New Jersey, and we're looking forward to supporting that initiative as a partner organization. And we see this as an opportunity to really engage with immigrant communities and empower them to become invested and participate in the democratic system and advocate for protective policies at the state levels. This is a big, last year was a big presidential election year. This year's a big gubernatorial election year. And there's a lot of power at the state level that we can use. And there are other things that we can do to make our democracy stronger and create stronger protective barriers for our immigrant communities. For instance, I, for one, am been working on same-day voter registration, but also in tandem working on this very exciting initiative to lower the voting age here in Newark. And what a part of that, while it would be a dream of mine as also a child of immigrant parents, an immigrant myself, that immigrants could one day vote. That's not the world we live in right now. But having young people be able to take control of their education in a meaningful way really allows, especially children of immigrant parents, to involve their parents in their education early on, and just create more engaged young people in the democratic process. And for me growing up, democracy wasn't something that was spoken about because my parents were legal permanent residents, as was I, and they didn't vote. So it's something that I've had to learn as an adult, and there's a lot of power in making our voices count at the ballot box. It's not where it ends, it's where it begins. But there are things that we could be doing in this state to make our democracy stronger, so all pockets of our community are being heard. For instance, we have a great language access law that was passed in recent years, but we still need a New Jersey Voting Rights Act to protect the voting rights at the state level and create more language access. The federal government has some protections and for language access at the voting booth, but we could be doing more. There are more, especially in New Jersey, where we live in such a diverse state and so many different languages are spoken here. It's just another way to create a more together community and just feel more connected to the mission. And so people are talking about what's going on and feel like they're a part of something, but also so that it's easier to mobilize these underrepresented voters or non-voters and have a stronger democracy overall. So I think that now more than ever, I see my job as not just a voting lawyer, but also to provide that kind of support to our partner organizations and moving some of these other policies along to have a stronger democracy here in New Jersey.
Thank you, Micauri. And I'm happy that you mentioned voting, because for me, one of the I would say interesting things about this past election was seeing how like so many people in my community, in the Latino community, voted against our own interests, and kind of like on the first day of Trump signing all these executive orders, a lot of those executive orders are directly going to impact people who voted for him and the loved ones of people who voted for him. So what role would you say like an organization like yours can play in educating people to not only vote, but to make better decisions at the polling booth?
Certainly. And that's that's always the struggle as a 501c3 is we are nonpartisan. So like obviously we want people to be civically engaged, but a big part of that is the civics education. But having access to that in the language that you speak would make it so much easier for people to know what's actually happening right now. I would, I don't should watch more news channels, but I don't watch the Spanish news channels. I know my parents do, for instance, and that's pretty much, if they're consuming news, that's all they're consuming. They don't know about where to go vote and like how to, like I tell them like there's an election. They live in New York. I'm just like, you should go vote. And these are the people running. There are resources and to expand on that. And a goal of ours is to translate as many of our voting materials as much as possible to Spanish. We are looking to expand some of that to other languages spoken in our area. Hopefully, we can expand to things like Portuguese and Creole and, all the other languages mainly spoken in New Jersey. But that's really like, I think key is the language access piece, and working towards getting these kinds of legislations passed that would allow, create stronger protections for voters in that regard would be fantastic. And namely, the New Jersey Voting Rights Act would do something like that, and why we feel very compelled to push those kinds of initiatives, and because we know it would have a very, I don't want to get into the federal VRA, but we know that the federal protections are virtually non-existent under this administration. So the best thing that we can do is push for these, tell our legislators and get these kinds of laws passed here to protect our voters. But in terms of civics education, yeah, the language access piece is something that I think our organization is striving to do better and wants to do more of in this time.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much for that. I know Oscar wanted to weigh in on this last question that I made. So Oscar, you have the floor.
Just to quickly comment that we don't know for absolute certain what percentage of people of Latin American origin really voted for the Republican option. And I think it is unfair to assume that we were the ones that got it wrong, because let's face it, I mean, the majority of voters across the board gave, President Trump their support. And I think that what that really challenges is how well are we handling the importance of civics education, the importance of understanding basic dynamics in the society we live in. I happen to believe that there is a big difference between knowing what the state of the economy is and how do I feel about it. And I think on the question of how do we feel about it, it's very problematic, because ironically, the reason why so many Americans, including people of Latin American origin, feel about the economy does not really have to do with the state of the economy according to macroeconomic indicators. It has to do with 5 decades of cumulative inequality in the way income and wealth are distributed in our country. But most people don't necessarily understand that, and nobody has been really educating voters in general about knowing much better who can potentially look after their interest. And I have to say, I think that if one lesson we should all learn from this past electoral campaign is that there is so much to improve, because clearly we're not really living up to the expectations of the majority of people in the country. Frankly, I think there is a lot to be done in terms of voter education across the board. But I also wanted to quickly, if I may, I wanted to go back to what you mentioned, Daisy, regarding the app that has been put out by the Mexican Foreign Ministry for their consular offices to be used. Let's remind ourselves, that nearly 45% of the entire undocumented population in the US are people from Mexico. So Mexican government is rightfully concerned and rightfully taking steps, to try to be on the preventive side of things. This also allows me to mention that in New Jersey, 25% at least of residents in New Jersey are foreign-born individuals, and that there are multiple nationalities represented in the immigrant population in New Jersey. At least to the best of my knowledge, the majority of them are from India, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Ecuador, and the Philippines, in that order. And then, of course, there are people from all over the US, in New Jersey. I also think it's important to remind ourselves that there are about 500,000 people in New Jersey who do not have immigration status, and they reside there, they're raising families there, they are contributing taxes to New Jersey, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I would dare to say that probably a good chunk of that nearly 500,000 people probably are, from Mexico, just based on the national statistics. And again, I mean, I think all of this is what this conversation is so important, not only for New Jersey, but important for any state, any city where there is such a significant presence of foreign nationals residing and making the country beautiful as it is. Because I, for one, don't buy for a second, that we really should be talking about these issues because they cause harm to the country. I really believe that immigrants and immigration, by and large, are a blessing to the country.
Well, I can definitely agree on that. And, I also applaud the Mexican government for taking that initiative in developing and launching that app. I think that it's very helpful and very thoughtful of their residents. Well, not residents, but, of Mexican nationals. So I was only applauding that. And then to go back to the other question, I definitely don't think that the Latino community in the U.S. Is in any way should be credited with Trump's win. I was more speaking from a personal level of experience and people who I know in my own community, even in my own family, and the discussions that dinner table discussions around politics and voting. And I think it's undeniable. I mean, there's been so many articles in different legacy newspapers written about Hispanics and Latinos for a variety of reasons, and many of them valid, voting, like I said, against our very own interests. And so that's pretty much what I was referring, but in no way was I saying, like we're the ones that put him there.
Just
Just
to be sure, because I've heard my share of blaming on Latino voters, which I think is completely unfair.
Just a note to Daisy, just so that Eliana is on the call. So I wasn't sure if you saw my chat
Oh,
message.
that's wonderful. I did not, but I would love to introduce her now. So we have Miss Eliana Fernandez. She's the organizing director of Make the Road, New Jersey, a Garden State immigrants' rights group that's been boots on the ground in many communities here in New Jersey, in Elizabeth, Passaic, Patterson, Newark, and Perth Amboy, helping undocumented residents prepare for Trump's presidency. Hi, how are you, Eliana?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Eliana Fernandez. I go by Eli, pronounce she, her, ella. And as Daisy mentioned, I'm the organizing director with Make the Road New Jersey, a community-based organization that fights and empowers Latinx and working communities across the state. I am, as a DACA recipient and documented person, this feels like a deja vu going back to 2017. It is sad and upsetting to be in this moment, but I think the role that we have to play as an organization is critical. I think the work of Make the Road New Jersey as an organization has always been to fight and defend communities, organize them, empower them, regardless of who sits at the White House. And I think that we want to be clear that we'll continue to do that no matter what the Trump administration will bring into our communities. The other thing about like the people that we serve, the community that we serve, that the majority of them are directly impacted, is like the beauty that exists within our community. Our folks are resilient. We have stood up to oppression before, and we'll do it all over again. We have taken our fights out to the streets, to the courts, and we have won, like, you know, time after time, because organizing and people's power actually work. And so, you know, under this new administration, something that I have been saying, and I think it's important to highlight to our community, is to remain calm. I feel like in this very chaotic environment that we're experiencing right now, everything seems like, you know, confusing, uncertain. And that's true for the majority of the people that we work with. I know that's true for my family, for people that come from mixed status family, for undocumented folks, even for folks who are like, you know, LPRs, green card holders and citizens, just because of the rhetoric that we have been hearing from the White House, right, in terms of like who are they targeting, and just by like sometimes like looks and like racial profiling. And so right now, I feel like one of the things that I think is like, you know, worth mentioning that is happening as we're speaking, the House of Representatives is about to vote in a bill called the Laken Riley Act. And it's really hard and heartbreaking to see how a personal tragedy is being used to scapegoat the immigrant community. And this will have a tremendous impact in our communities across the country, right? Like we're talking about indefinite detention. We're talking about even children put into detention. And you don't even have to be convicted of a crime just by the merit of being accused, not having access to a due process. And I feel like also granting red states and state general attorney generals like the power over federal immigration, I think is like very alarming, because legislations like that can serve as a highway to mass deportation. And so I feel like in New Jersey, there's ways, right, to like, you know, prevent that, and also in different states. How can we respond as an organization, as a state, to stand up and fight for immigrants is really critical. And I think, like, you know, right now in the state of New Jersey, an immediate solution that we have, it's the Immigrant Trust Act that was recently reintroduced, which will help, right, prevent the deportation system by creating like a data privacy protections for people who interact with the state and local agencies. And I think I just want to know that, because when people in our communities are fearful to access services that are critical for their survival because they're afraid of immigration, can have other type of consequences in our community, right? Like the medical attention that they need for themselves or their kids. And so I feel like that could be one of the immediate solutions that could be put in place to protect our communities. And I know we have been working around the clock, reaching out to the entire New Jersey delegation to make sure like everyone votes against this bill. But it seems likely that this will happen and become one of the first and most damaging legislations under the Trump administration. So I'll say, like, you know, one, like making sure that we are processing this information, and at the same time, like thinking and figure out how is it that we're going to do to continue to protect our community. And so with all of these things in mind, and thinking about like all of the plans that the Trump administration has for our family, it has been critical for us to start, like, you know, planning already Know Your Rights workshops. I think the main thing right here in this moment is letting our community know that regardless of their immigration status, they have rights, right? And we are doing that by having a street outreach every week, where our organizers are actually, like, you know, going out, talking to people in the community, making sure that they're informed, and at the same time, inviting them into our spaces, and in having them come to our community centers in Elizabeth, Passaic, and Pertham boys, so they can learn a little bit more about like the rights and how they can protect themselves and their families. Because I think it's easier to say like, you know, stay calm, especially when all of the things or bad things that you're hearing in the news and it's like pretty scary. I always tell people like knowledge is power, and the more informed we are and the more prepared we are, the better we are to respond to what's to come our way. And so I feel like that is going to be like, you know, critical from now on to be able to protect our communities, continue to have these educations, making sure that we are providing the right resources. And the other thing I said, like, you know, in terms of like, you know, protecting our community, I always tell folks, when thinking about your own immigration or personal cases, make sure that you're working with an immigration attorney that you trust, or organizations that are actually like, you know, going to work on your behalf, and avoid notarious fraud. Because I feel like every time something comes out on immigration and then we see an increase of people being victims of immigration fraud. And so I feel like that's another piece that is very important in this process under this new administration. The other thing is like to continue to empower our community. Our community, you know, needs to be more politicized. They need to learn about like, you know, what's happening, not only across the country, but also in our own states. And I feel like one of the best ways that we're going to be able to continue to further build that power in our communities is making sure that we understand like the small wins that we can get in our like counties and like, you know, cities are going to be crucial, because the makeup that we have right now, we have a trifecta, right? Like we have a Republican presidency, House and Senate. And so we wouldn't be able to pass anything related to immigration. And so the work that we're going to have to do locally to protect the immigrant community is going to be critical to be able to protect the thousands of immigrants that currently live in New Jersey. So we are up for the task, you know, really excited to continue to empower our community. And the last thing that I will say is, as people who are working directly with the immigrants who are impacted, is really I think it's really key not to cave into like, you know, fear, and also convey that message to our community. We want to work for we want to be able to have a way of like working with the community that is more proactive as opposed to like, you know, reactive. And I feel like that's a lesson that we carry from the previous administration. There's going to be a lot of that is going to be happening and coming out on immigration, like I assume almost on a daily basis. But at the same time, we cannot lose sight of the fights that we need to do, the legislations that we need to push here in the state. As Micauri mentioned, like, for example, the 1 million voter project that we have in the state of New Jersey, to be able to talk to people at their doors, like, you know, hear about, like, you know, their concerns, think about, like, you know, what are the issues that directly impacting, because even for our immigrant community, although immigration is at the top of the ticket, we need also, like, to think about, like, you know, the fundamental survival stuff that they need, such as, like, you know, housing, access to healthcare, education, and other things. So as much as we're going to be fighting for immigration and to protect and safeguard the life of the immigrants, we also want to make sure that we are fighting at a state and local level to be able to protect them.
Thank you for that, Ellie. You know, I know that you, like I mentioned earlier, and you said yourself, you know, your organization has really been out there in the community, talking to people, teaching them about their rights. But what are you hearing from people in the community? Like, what is the overall sentiment? One of our previous speakers, Oscar from Alianza Americas, mentioned people that might self-deport, you know, before getting sent back. They're kind of just leaving because they do have this immense fear that things might not go the way that they hope. Is that something that you're hearing or seeing here in New Jersey?
I think like, you know, there's like a big concern and fear, rightfully so, right? Like I feel like right now everything is so like uncertain. And so that's what I feel like when the work that we do comes in handy, right? Like the reference that I made before is like making sure that we as community organizers, as a community leaders, don't lead from a place of fear is like really important, because I feel like at the end of the day, the goal for the Trump administration is push people to desperation where they can like, you know, self-deport, or use the fear tactics that they can scare our community, so they don't send their kids to school, so they don't go to work. And I feel like that is something that we got to be able to combat, right? And making sure that we are providing the community with the tools that they need to be able to fight that. And as I said before, like many people don't think that they have rights, right? And there's like fundamental rights that we have regardless of like who we are or where we come from. Like, for example, asking for an attorney, like, you know, staying in silence, not opening the door unless they have a judicial order. And so all of those things I feel like right now is like, you know, important. And I would say the other thing is also having conversations as the family, right? I think this is like a pretty scary, like, you know, moment that requires a lot of thinking with a cold head, right? Like I remember myself when 2017 happened, I was like paralyzed because I was like so afraid. I was afraid for myself. I was afraid for my children. And someone who has firsthand like lived that experience, that's when I, you know, have those very like honest conversations with our folks, that like we will see like, you know, the Trump administration trying to undermine all the progress that we have made in the last couple of years, right? And the one thing that I feel like, you know, it's important is like the people who are standing in the way for Trump to be able to, you know, execute his agenda. It's like organizations like ours who are here on this call. He will try with all his power to put in place policies such as like, you know, ending birthright citizenship, right? But like there will be counter litigation, like, you know, fighting that. And we also saw that in the previous administration for all the legislations that he put, right? Like there was already a plan of like defense. And I feel like that's what we do in the majority of the states, right? Like making sure that we are finding like, you know, ways to safeguard our community. And so that's the message that I try to use with our folks, right? Like making sure that we're steering them away from like, you know, fear to take drastic decisions that will impact their families for like, you know, years to come. And also like, you know, remind them like, you know, we as immigrants, we are the backbone for our economy. We play essential roles in our communities and across the country. And so, you know, we have resisted once before, and I think we can do it again, but it will require like a lot of work, a lot of education, a lot of interaction, and also a lot of, you know, taking our fight out to the streets, and also like accountability with our elected officials and who represent us in Washington and also here in the state.
We have about 15 minutes left for the top of the hour, so I do want to make sure we get to audience questions. Oni, you had been flagging a few in the chat. Did you want to call out any of the ones, or unless Daisy, you wanted to scroll through the chat.
Yeah, Daisy, I plug you on this. If you can start
Okay,
addressing one of these questions.
sounds good. So the first one that caught my eye is from Moshin Sahir from the Urdu News. His question is, for immigrant community members without legal status who are uncertain about whether to go to work or leave their homes, what guidance or resources can they rely on? Additionally, are there any ways to have some kind of accurate information about any possible immigration raids or potential arrests in New Jersey? I don't know who wants to take that one. Maybe Oscar. Do you feel comfortable answering that, or Ellie?
I can provide some comments, and I'm sure others will too. I mean, bottom line is, look, the vast majority of the immigrant population that lives in the country are actually employed, and their employers love them, and they need to work, because if they don't work, there is no food on the table. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because yes, people are fearful, rightfully so, that there could be indeed imminent arrest, imminent detention, deportation, but still people have to go on with their lives, and frankly, in previous attempts to foster the idea of self-deportation, I don't think there is any evidence at all to suggest that people will simply just pack their bags and go. I mean, that hasn't worked, because you have to remember what kind of option does that mean for livelihood for people. Like if somebody is being sent back to Venezuela, I mean, is that going to be any better, than they are experiencing here? So I think you have to put that in the context. And finally, I don't know, maybe somebody else in the call here do, but I don't know that there is a single place where to go to monitor through a sort of clearinghouse where are raids taking place. I think that that's the kind of work that we need to still improve from what we have. Because again, I mean, we all want to know. I mean, a lot of people were calling us in Chicago. What can you tell me about where are the raids happening? And, there were no raids as of this morning. I mean, it was just people being alert that it could happen, but it hasn't yet happened. And by the way, I took freedom to answer some of the questions in the chat box as well.
Thank you for that, Oscar. I'm sure that's very helpful and that it's very, very appreciated. Let me see if I can find one that maybe you didn't already help answer.
I think Ellie wants to add to that question.
Sure, please.
Yes, one thing that I will add to that question regarding people feeling fearful to go to their jobs. There's also rights for employers, right? Like they have ways that they can use to protect their workers, right? I'll be more than happy to share some of those resources. And at the same time, there's a different rights that would apply when people are at work, right? And I think that's also important for our community to know. Like there are different settings when thinking about know your rights and what to do, either if you are outside on the street or your job site or your house. And I'll be more than happy to share that information. And the last thing related to the rates. Right now, there's not a mechanism that per se will work to alert us in New Jersey that are being that the raids are being taken place in a certain location. I think that's something some of the backward that we're trying to do to have a more cohesive reaction when it comes to that. There are, however, on the other hand, a lot of different applications and chats that a lot of us are part of that are informing about actual rates taking place. And I think on that the last thing that I will say, sometimes there's confusion when there's a raid actually happening or when we see a nice car outside in our communities. And so that's another thing that we also doing with the community to make sure we can tell the difference. And hopefully there's a better way to track if those were to happen in our state.
Now, I saw another question in the chat that you may be able to help answer, Ellie. So this one is from Mari Carmen Amado. Are there any plans by pro-immigrant organizations and pro bono attorneys to prevent the deportation of undocumented people who are arrested in raids when agents verify that these people are workers and don't have any criminal record, since the executive order indicates that only criminals will be deported? Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Make the Road New Jersey does have some legal services.
Absolutely. Yes, I think there's like a lot of, work behind the scenes that is being done with where providers thinking about like, what is the capacity that organizations have to be able to like offer like legal services, in this case, like, detention defense. Yes, I feel like that's something that has been like, considered and thought about it because of like what we have experienced in the past. And at the same time, I would say like, the people in our community, like if I was to like, be detained, even as a DACA recipient, I still have rights to a due process. And so, that's really important to keep in mind, but definitely like, yes, there has been like a lot of conversations on how we can provide legal support and deportation defense. We also have some documents in our website that people can access to in terms of like, what can you do if you were to be detained.
I'll also add to that I did a quick Google search as you were speaking, and I did see here that there's other groups like the Immigration Advocates Network and Immigration Law Help, other groups that are also nonprofits and dedicate themselves specifically to providing pro bono services to undocumented people. So I hope that answered your question, Mari Carmen. I'm gonna scan and see if there's other questions. But if anyone has a question now that hasn't submitted it, I encourage you to ask it.
I'll just note for those of you asking in the chat, we will be sending out a recording of this as well as the summary notes and contact information for our speakers, provided that they let us distribute those.
Go ahead, Daisy.
Do you see anything that I missed? I'm looking through, and it seems like some of the questions are.
I think there's one coming from Carlos.
Carlos Avila. Let me see. So it says, please, we need the panelist contact information. We can definitely share that. We can definitely share that with you, Carlos. I don't know. That might just.
And then there's one from Oran. There's one from Oran.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's at the very top from Oran Accord. The question is: the department ordered U.S. attorneys to investigate local law enforcement officials if they refuse to enforce new immigration policies. Instead, officials who fail to comply could face prosecution. So what state can do it against this action to protect the immigrants?
So it seems that Oscar took a stab at that, but would you care to elaborate a little bit about that, Oscar?
In addition to what I wrote in the chat, I think that what really matters, and this will, I believe, become crucial, not only on the matter of immigration policy, but in face of an administration that does not hide its tendencies to want to be autocratic, even dictatorial. I think states and local governments will need to do a much better job of figuring out how can they really oppose something that is simply inconsistent with the democratic values and democratic laws of the US. And I think that that is something that, frankly, from the opposite end of the spectrum, and I'm thinking of Texas, I'm thinking of Florida, they've done very well interpreting their own laws to figure out how they can counter federal authority when they don't agree, with whatever is coming out from the federal government. So I don't think that there is anything symmetrically similar, equal, to that particular attempt. And I think that that's going to be a huge legal challenge, political challenge as well, if we are to contain an abusive federal government.
Thank you so much for that response, Oscar. I think that might be it in
I think
terms of
so.
questions.
Yeah, and again, as we said, you're going to get the recording, the transcript, all the good stuff, contact information. We also sent out a list of resources as well as the speaker bios from today if you'd like to follow up for your reporting. If you do report on the webinar and the contents of today, please send it to us so we can help you share and distribute it, as I'm sure everyone else on the call would be happy and more than willing to do, so we can get that word out and get that information out to as many people as possible. Thank you again, Daisy, and our panelists. This was jam-packed, just absolutely fantastic. And the center, as always, will be here as a sounding board and as a connector to help you all reach each other if necessary. So stay safe out there and have a good rest of the week.